Well, good afternoon to everyone. It's good to see everybody here. I'm going to do my brief introduction in the Omaha language, as my mom has taught me. And this is how we begin. It's like Ebebelite, Wiblatamik, Omaha, Jaje, Witate, Shonge, Hube, Wahu. Wahe, Jaje, Witate, Renee, Souci, Omaha, Wahu. So what I said was, let me introduce myself. My Omaha name is Sacred Horsewoman. My English name is Renee Souci. I'm an Omaha woman. By doing so then, I'm just letting you know in a very, I guess, short and sweet way who I am and what tribe I am. That gives you an idea that if you're familiar with any of our tribal history, culture, customs, etc., this is very something that all of us practice whenever we're engaged in any kind of, I guess now, contemporary society. If we're engaged in a conference, then everywhere I go and I'm meeting other tribes, then this is always something that we do, very standard protocol. Well, in that introduction then, I just wanted to acknowledge my mother. My mother's name was Alice Souci. Ivinge, as we say in Omaha. It's like she's in the spirit world now. So my mother was a language instructor. She taught the Omaha language for 16 years and dedicated the rest of her life to teaching the language and preserving the language. And after her death, a book was published posthumously on the Omaha language, 500 plus verbs in Omaha. Omaha is how we say Omaha. So Omaha of the city is named after my tribe, and that was part of our territory. So in Omaha, what that means is against the current. Our stories say, we know where we came from, we know how we got here, and how we got here to Bthaska. What it's called now is Nebraska. So our stories are so well connected into where we're at in this area at this time. Right now, it's like we are in a location that was formerly a part of the Oto, Iowa territory. And I was explaining earlier about territories. It's like the questions that can come up when you're talking to a native person. You don't know what questions to ask because you're like, oh, okay, what do I even say? Yeah. So if you asked me and said, Renee, where are you from? My response is going to be, well, I'm from the Omaha Nation. And you're going to go, what is that? What? If you're a tribal person and I ask, where you're from and you told me I'm from this tribe or this nation, I'm going to have this thought and go, my mind's going to go in all these different directions and I'm going to say, oh, okay, I know. All right, I have an idea. Because we're talking about territories again. We're not talking about a specific location where I'm at this moment. We're talking about, I'm from the Omaha Nation, so that's like a huge territory. And believe me, even in this present time, we still acknowledge those territories. We're not thinking of states or cities or, who owns what. We're thinking like, well, this was our traditional lands. They still are our traditional lands. It does not change in our perspective. So going through such teachings, my mother was a very strict teacher for me. So she, as such, was always conscious of everything. She made sure that I understood that when I was speaking before the people, that I better present myself in the fashion that bestowed who I was. In other words, the status that I carried on her behalf. So I had to therefore also be well spoken and also be well-mannered because I'm representing her and her honor. So that, having that kind of upbringing, you can only imagine, as, many women do, we're very, we have to be very expressive and not afraid. So what I'm presenting on is about Bthaska. Bthaska, our name, like I said, what the state is called now, Nebraska. Bthaska was our name for the Platte River. So Ni meaning water, Bthaska meaning flat, like the table. So the two words coming together to make that word, Bthaska, flat water. This is what you're saying every time you say Nebraska. I always ask people jokingly, do you know any Omaha words? And everybody's looking at me. I said, I bet you do. And I said, who knows the word Nebraska? And everybody raises their hand. I said, that's an Omaha word. So, to give you an idea, what I'm talking about how I came to be a water educator, a water advocate. The journey, is much like water. And the journey for me was understanding that in this whole process of what I had gone through from childhood to the present was an indoctrination. I had talked about that earlier, about the conditioning, about, who we are as women. Well, as Native people, we went through that conditioning forcefully, if you're familiar with Native history. I don't say Native American, if you notice that, because I don't consider myself an American. I consider myself tribal first. American is kind of like, optional. I'm Omaha first. So, the journey. I can share my little story again about, what changed my life. And of course it was my mother. I got married, when I was about 30. Had, my children. I think I was probably about 39 maybe. I had my last child. And well, in that time frame, in the middle of that, after having my second child, then my mom came and showed up on my doorstep. And here I was, all blissful, like, oh, I'm a housewife, I got my babies, I'm happy, right? And she came and she was knocking at my door, and she was sitting there, and she goes, they got this program at the school in Macy, and you better go over there and sign up. And your mom is giving you that kind of direction and, that order. You're like, here I am holding it. But, I'm taking care of my family. Their dad's working and we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? And, this whole. And she goes, no. And she kept coming back. And I was arguing against, trying, what she wanted me to do because, I thought, I already had come here to UNL. This was a program that was through UNL. And I said, they didn't treat me very well here. In fact, I'm very mad at them. When I left in 1989, I swore I was not coming back to Lincoln or UNL. And I said, I'm not going back there, Mom. She kept after me. She literally dragged me. Picked me up, loaded up me and my babies, and drove us to Macy. And made me, literally dragged me into that office, Here I am, and gets me in there, and then she goes, okay, there, talk to this woman. And I'm looking at everyone. There was a classroom that was already, there was a class taking place already. And some of the students were, they were my peers, and they were like, oh, hi, Renee, come on in. So then I wound up talking. But in that process, what happened was I got accepted into this teaching program. And I was so surprised. I thought, what? they actually do want me to come back to UNL? Yeah, so I had this disbelief, right? And once though, you know, I was accepted in December. By January, I was back into classes. Our classes were all there at Omaha Nation Public School. The teacherage, they had a classroom about this size, maybe. And this is where our cohort met. And the classes were intense. I've been told that the classes are even more intense than what they actually do with the Teachers College and, what is it? What do they call it now?
CHS.
What is it?
College of Education Human Sciences.
Yes, but it was still the Teachers College when I started, so. Yeah, so for those 2 years that I was there, because I already had a number of classes behind me, my experience with education wasn't too great. But once I got into this program, I said, okay, I see the purpose of it. I'm going to do this. And I made up my mind, I'm going to do this. Had very little sleep, as you know, as educators. Slept maybe about 3 hours a night because here I am balancing, you know, children and family and classes and practicum, and then I had 2 more children to top it off. So in the midst of this, as I'm getting ready to graduate, I started going through all this training that they had offered, and I got into the, I think it was Project WET, if you're familiar with Project WET and you know how it is developed for educators. And my questions, I kept asking questions of the trainer. Well, where's the native? You know, where's the native side to all this? And she goes, well, I can't answer that. You know, that's something that your tribes are going to have to do. And then finally, the second time I think I had gone through training with her, she said, okay, we got this program called Native Waters. Oh, that hit a chord. So how I came about getting involved with water education from that point on through Project WET led me to Native Waters. And Native Waters was based in Bozeman, Montana. And not too far from there, as many of you may know, is, you know, where the headwaters for the Missouri begin. So that's where my training began on the tribal perspective of the Missouri. And all the tribes that were involved, that I live along the Missouri River basin. And I met all of these tribes and all these educators. And one thing I noticed immediately was that there were a lot of tribal people who had French names like me, because I'm of French descent from the fur traders that came through the Missouri. So I thought, oh man, those French people sure got around. So in that way, it was like, you know, we're descendants, and at the same time, we're all playing these different roles. I made all these notes, and I thought, well, you know, that's the humorous side of the story. The truth that came out of that was seeing the results that, you know, that came along later after first contact, and what happened along the river, how the river was contained, just like we were, you know. We were cleared off the land, we were contained on reservations, and then, you know, the water was, you know, that happened to the water as well. They wanted to tame the Missouri, wanted to tame the Platte, and this is a whole different perspective because, you know, I choose to see something like, why did they do that, you know? What have they done? You know, I'm talking about the Army Corps of Engineers and everybody, the government, and I couldn't understand, you know, because of the permanent settlements in regards to what I'm talking about. Permanent settlements, you know, towns, cities, villages, etc. But Native people, we didn't live that way. We lived around, you know, our environment. We knew when it was going to flood, so we moved our camps to to another location that we would camp where we would not be in the flood. Then again, we moved again. Harvest time came, we moved again. Then we moved back to our winter camps. So this movement was also in a sense of an environmental control. We weren't depleting one area. And we were very good scientists because we understood all the plants that were in each environment. And we documented it within our ways that we did. So, once I became an educator, this all opened up for me. Then I started to view the world in a different manner. And then I had to thank my mom for dragging me in to, sign up for this tutoring program. And I still thank her every day. Native Waters was one way that brought educators together, and native and non-native, but also in learning about one another and the kind of work that we were doing, whether it was water management or education or environmental. And out of that came a film called A Dream for Water that was filmed up on the Blackfeet Reservation up there in Montana. I spent a lot of time up there at the Blackfeet Reservation. Then I thought, well, okay, I was a cultural advisor for the program for about 4 years. And then coming back here to Nebraska, I kept thinking, well, where do I even begin to outline this kind of work? Because I don't even know what to call it. If you think about it, where do you fit in? So I was trying to fit myself into something, I guess, in the bigger picture. How does this work? So for me, part of what started to happen as, the water, like I was moving like water. I began a spiritual life, our tradition, in 1985. But it was a gradual training. And by the time, I was married and had children, I made more of a commitment by the time my children were born. And after my children, were of age where I could start to dedicate myself to the spiritual process, that was about 2003, 2004. And further, it continued on. When you're going through this kind of training, there's no, it's not like a classroom like this. Ceremony is outside. It might be indoors, but it'll be in something entirely different. And the way we see things or perceive, the world, it's always round. And so when we sit, like in our ceremonies, we're always sitting in a circle. Even if it's a long oval circle, we're still sitting in a circle. And there's very little in the center. I was trying to explain this to someone the other day. I said, if you go to a native gathering, you're always going to see the people in a circle, and you're not going to see anything in the middle. And unless there's a fireplace or drum or something that's representative there. I said, but when you're taught this protocol, which I've been taught from, I don't know, from the time I can remember, you go around a circle. You never cut across. You don't just, I said, that's like the height of bad manners, to cut across that space. That's a sacred space. So we go around all the time. That's one thing you're going to notice about our ceremonies. When I began learning about water ceremonies, about 2007, 2008, then I began to learn about women's roles as protectors of the water. Because for Native women, women are the caregivers, but also they take care of the water. Because what do we do when we're carrying our children? They're in water. We're carrying that water naturally. So that's our role. The men's role is to take care of the fire. There's a balance there, represented. And so in everything that I was starting to learn was about that balance. water ceremonies, the women protectors of the water. That leads me into what Josephine Mondamin. And Josephine, she made her journey just in February to the spirit world. Spirit world meaning, you know, whatever concept you hold of, whatever that might be, afterlife, I guess. We have a whole different concept of that and how that works, so I won't go into that because that's a whole different discussion. Josephine Mondamin, and I can read just a, you know, like a little bit here. This says, meet Josephine Mondamin, Anishinabe Quake, the water walker. This is what her title was. With a copper pail of water in one hand and a staff in the other, Josephine Mondamin and Anishinabe Quake grandmother took on a sacred walk, traversing over 10,900 miles around each of the Great Lakes. She is known as the water walker. And she began this process in the maybe 2005, 2004. And I think she walked around all the Great Lakes by 2008. The last walk she took, I think it was in 2014. So altogether, her miles that she walked for the water, to pray for the water, all the water of the earth, not just, you know, here. She walked over 17,000 kilometers, 17,000 miles, something, you know. Well, and on this, it says, according to the Michigan Sea Grant, the Great Lakes shoreline is equal to walking almost 44% of the circumference of the earth. So when you see someone walking with a pail of water, you wonder, where is she going with that water? So the message is, water is very precious, and I will go to any lengths to and direction to carry the water to the people. And Grandma Josephine set a good example for everybody, because she definitely did walk her talk. This was her, like, again, one of her life's missions, was to bring awareness to the precariousness of good drinking water, healthy water, and she did this because of her spiritual beliefs. Now, there was a water walk that came through here and started up at the Missouri headwaters and ended when they hit the confluence of the Mississippi. And that water walk was about 2017. And I can't remember how many days it took. I think they started in April, so about this time of the year, and they ended in September. And I only got to walk with them for one day. I was like, oh gosh, I so want to go walk with them, and it didn't work for my schedule, but there it was. When they got here to, they got to the city, and then they came to Omaha, and I thought, well, that's the only time I'm going to have to be able to go and walk with them. So just from walking from Blair to through Omaha and just outside of Omaha, that took us a whole day. And I can honestly tell you, I've done spiritual runs. You know, I've done all kinds of runs for you name it. And I'm not an athletic person. But when I believe in doing something, I will do it. But doing the water now, carrying the water, that just blew me away. Because I always wanted to do that. I spent one day doing it, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know how these women do this for, those months on end. It was a good teaching to understand the importance, of water. And I felt I felt like this is part of my duty, is to be able to do that. So, in 2008, I was part of the organizing of the Indigenous water policy and leadership training. And I was living in the Twin Cities at the time. And during this time, I had one of my sisters, in the way that we say sister, who was organizing this, and she asked for my help. But this was part of the reflections, and I can share just a little bit of that given the amount of time we have. But these are her reflections, and the reflection is from her perspective, because she's Mexica Mayan. And so she was talking about Chauchi Tlique. Chauchi Tlique is one of the water gods of the Mexica and Mayan people. And so every year in St. Paul, they would have the Chauchi Tlique environmental conference about water. So this one that we were a part of was the Indigenous Women's Water Policy and Leadership Training. This was March 2008. And we met at Lake Bthaska, the biological field station. So, and she said, before I read the evaluations that I'm just patiently waiting to unfold, I want to leave a written reflection on the weekend's event. I returned home to a fresh soft blanket of snow and a new pint of sap in our maple bucket. It was 40 degrees in northern Minnesota when we left early this afternoon, and 25 in St. Paul when we arrived here at 5 p.m. Interesting temperature change. This weekend was the most recent culmination of years of work toward an endeavor to bring together the scientific and cultural knowledge of our local Indigenous communities in an effort to boost our community readiness to engage in strategic systems change in water policy and management in local, state, and federal arenas. So the goal, as she had outlined, this was when we came together, we had Indigenous women from Canada that came down, as well as the people that came to this continent. The men that came here especially, they arrived, and they were making their journeys, and they always sought out the other men of our tribe who were serving as the warriors and the chiefs and so forth, but they had very specific roles. They always, these men that came, always wanted to speak to who are the people in charge of your economic base. And they always pointed at us. And they would say, no, we want to know the real people in charge. We want to know your chief, let's speak to him. And so that would happen, but then the chief had his duties, yes, to take care of the people, yes. But he wasn't in charge of the economic base in the way that these Western European men that came over thought. So our balance was disrupted. That's what we say. Educators, Native educators, we talk about this disruption cycle. We had, we always show it if we use the timeline. We show it, say, okay, this is what it was like for thousands of years, and then now we had this disruption for about 500 years. Okay, now we're carrying on, because now we came back to our way, and we're bringing it to the contemporary way. This is how Native educators speak about it. So the disruption, as we would say, is past us, because now we know what happened. Now we got to continue going forward with the technological understanding that we had from previous times to bring it up to this present time to help us engage in what's happening to the world at this moment. This is what we call traditional ecological knowledge, TEK. And that's such a catchphrase right now. So TEK, if you hear that, that's what, you're engaging with scientists and the research, base that's being developed right now about TEK. And sustainability programs are occurring all over Indian country, as we say. This is what's happening, that leads into, all these things that are going on. Chauchi Tlique and having such indigenous environmental programs is one way to help in bringing our, I guess you'd say, our sisters here to understand and engage with us. It's kind of like, again, you have to change your thought process. So this leads me to talking about no KXL in 2010. You know, when I was reading about all this, I was living at home on the res again, living with my mom for a period of time, and reading all the articles that were coming up. And then I came across an article that it just burned me up. It was my own tribe supporting, you know, the KXL pipeline. I was in shock. I was like, what? What? You know, and so I remember I was so angry. I was sitting in my van and my mom was sitting beside me, and I was like, I can't believe they would do such a thing. You know, what are they thinking? And I was, you know, then I was starting to cry. And so my mom was just sitting there listening to me, and she says, well, what are you going to do about it? And I was like, you know, so then I was like, okay, I'll write a letter. I'll write a letter to my tribal council. And so I did. I drafted up my letter, got it ready, and I took it into them. Handed it to them each one by one. And I told them in my letter, I said, if you support this pipeline, I'm going to make it rain. And I'm going to bring these people down, and you are going to see things that you are not, you know, you've never seen before. Pretty much, that was essentially what I said in my letter. They didn't support it, they changed, you know. And I talked to one of the councilmen, I said, I hope you guys don't do that, because I got people who will come down here and make you change your minds to help me, you know. So they had to learn that, you know, the perspective that I, as a Native woman, carry is protecting the water. But not only that, protecting the earth. That's my responsibility, spiritually as well as educationally. My daughter was the one, my youngest one, you know, when she started to learn about all this, she cried, you know, and she came to me and she said, Mom, I want to pray about this, you know, because in our way. So I took her outside, we were under the starlight, and she was saying her prayers, you know, this little girl, my youngest. And I was listening to her, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know. Whew, that's, you know, so because of what she had prayed about, I was like, okay, I'm ready to make this vow. I will help in whatever way I can. And it did come about, 2013. We met up there at Neely, Art Tanderup's farm. They had all these native spiritual grandmothers there, and I went. And one of the grandmothers, you know, came and gave me this, she marked me. We call it wase, it's paint, the sacred paint. When she marked me, that was my vow to protect the water. So I was like, okay, now I am really committed. Whoa, I don't know what that means, you know. I mean, you know, when you want to do something, you're idealistic, but you oftentimes don't know exactly what that means. What does that even look like? Does that mean I have to stand up there in the front lines, as they say, and, you know, protect, you know, stand in front of whatever that is and be run over by whatever you're bringing at us, or, you know. So that was one of the things that happened. And then I continued that work of carrying out, you know, testimonies, you name it, to bring that attention to water. Then someone contacted me from, I think, the Platte River Basin, the project that was presented on earlier, and they said, we want to interview you. So I said, okay, fine, you know. So that was done in 2015. And that's still online. You can look it up and read, you know, what I said in my interview. Then along came Standing Rock, right? And in that time frame, I was continuing to do the kind of work that I do with the water, which are the water ceremonies. And when Standing Rock came, I can remember, like in August of 2016, you know, this call to action came. And it was just like, you know, I don't know, I can't describe it other than that. It was like it woke me up, like, okay, I'm being called to action. All right, I will go and show my support. And that experience also helped in a way to continue to shape how I carry out my work. So am I going to be an activist? Am I going to be an educator? Or am I going to be a spiritual elder, teacher, you name it? And it's like, wow, I can't separate them. There's no way I can. So answering such a call, and it showed me when we saw all the people there and having that experience, it was like, it was very uplifting. It was very much, the violence was eye-opening. I wasn't there when all of that was taking place, but I watched every part of it. And I can say it did bring awareness, if anything. I wanted to make note of something. I was writing my notes as I was sitting here listening to everybody. It's like, for someone like me, and I'm not the only one, that's what I'm trying to say, but for someone like me, we are bombarded. And we're bombarded because we're taking on so many different roles, especially when you become an elder, as they say. Those roles are something that we earn. It's not something we just assume or take on. It's not an automatic. And the only way I can explain it is that, my mom was a good role model in that way. She focused on the language, and that was her role. And everybody knew it. But she, in my tribe, she was a rock star. All the other tribes consulted her, So everybody in the country knew who she was in, the linguistic world. Having that experience with her, and then understanding that, okay, if I'm going to take on a similar role, what does that really look like? I have no idea. Nobody's there to role model this for me. Only other Native women that I know that are doing similar things and some of them are, we're all based far apart. So the way I was trying to develop this model was that if I'm standing in the center, I'm looking at all these roles that I'm taking on, whether it's for water, and then I have my mother's legacy with the language, and then I'm a teaching artist and I work with the arts, and then with the earth, the environment. I always liked what Casey Camp-Hornick says about language. She says you cannot separate the language from the land, which makes complete sense to me, because I think of Nebraska, I think of all these place names here in Nebraska. I think of our, which recalls me to, this is where we went for this is how we did this, and we knew which places to avoid. We understood the timelines, what happened at certain parts of the season, and we had such a way developed that we knew what to expect. That, when we saw certain things, certain signs, oh, okay, it's time to do this now. All right, let's get ready to do that. So for me, the way that I'm learning how to balance it in a contemporary sense now, because I'm taking on traditional roles that we've had for thousands of years. To balance in this society, oh my gosh, it's nearly impossible. As you know, as women, having multiple roles. And the reason why I say that is I'm trying to maintain a way of life that has been jeopardized, that has been diminished, and I'm trying to revitalize them in order to help what's going on in the current time. But not only that, because of the kind of responsibilities that go along with such roles. I'm on call 24/7. So if somebody shows up on my doorstep needing help, then I'm on call to help them. Why? Because of what I carry for the people. And when I hold out my hands like that, that means I'm carrying something spiritual, literally. In our language, we'd say wabachte. That means a bundle. And when you hear natives talk about bundles, they're talking about their sacred items. They're carrying something for the people. That bundle has specific responsibilities. Responsibilities that continue on to this day. So to point out, like, you know, what this means, I'm going into now rights of nature. And one of my mentors, again, Casey Camp Hornick, is a person that I do look to as an older sister. And I'll be seeing her in about 2 weeks. As an older sister then, because she's led all these movements for environment, she's traveled the world, she's done everything you could possibly think of to protect water and earth. So if I can see her as a role model, then there's others out there, definitely. Now, so for us Native women, we're taking on roles. Teachers, like I said, role models. We have to be linguists, historians, healers, lawyers, and then the protectors all in one. So we cannot separate the language from the land. That's the whole thought process again. And by being a lawyer, what I mean is that we have to know our treaties and we have to know all the laws that go with the land. From the United States government, to states, to tribal governments, to, you know, how do we implement such laws as rights of nature? Other places have done so throughout the world. So it says, expanding the body of legal rights to include nature has been an idea brewing for generations. Indeed, more than a century ago, environmentalist John Muir, and I've read about John Muir, wrote that we must respect the rights of all the rest of creation. And he's not the best role model to use in this regard, but I do, you know, like how that's stated. 2015, Pope Francis stated that true right of the environment does exist. Okay, so you're acknowledging what men have said. And I kind of a definition like that I see, and I met some of the people at the Pioneers Conference about 3 years ago that were working on rights of nature in New Zealand. So this is what caught my attention and sparked my interest in learning more. How does this even work? How do we even apply it? So now, you know, New Zealand is known for its willingness to be first and to take principled steps into the social unknown. In 1893, they were the first nation to grant women the vote. In the 1970s, they took an unpopular anti-nuclear stance and da-da-da-da. But from the Maori perspective, the Crown or New Zealand's government has been slow to recognize the legitimacy of their culture and heritage. So which is parallel to what is going on here as well. What happened in New Zealand happened to us. What happened to us happened in New Zealand, etc., etc. So I'm going to start looking more into it because as I'm going along, you know, and people know what kind of work I do, you know, they're coming and saying, you know, can you help us do this? So I had an elder approach me this week. And as a teaching artist, I work with kids. I teach them poetry. But my poetry that I teach is a method based on our Umaha ways. Because I always say we were always poets because we sing. That's our lyrics that are contained in those songs, which are hundreds of years old that we still sing. That's our history. So when I'm teaching, then I'm helping the kids understand their connection back to the earth. This elder said, Renee, there's a spring that runs through the center of town. And you know, and I'm like, yeah, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. She goes, no, not that one. This one that runs close to the school. And it's ironic that, you know, that the school is aware of it, but they're not thinking of it in a cultural, spiritual, historic sense. So I was there yesterday, and she said, you know, let's meet and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So we went to see it. And I was like, oh my God, you know, these are the things sometimes that we're not even aware of within our own little, in our communities. That's something we might totally take for granted. That's what, you know, that's what this made me look. I mean, I could be out in the world and doing all this, whatever, fantastic things, but if this is right in my own community, then I better pay attention, as this elder had asked. So we looked, and then we talked to the superintendent and to the principal, and we said, these are our concerns. We don't want you to cover up that spring. All the springs that I know of on our reservation have been covered up. And that's, you know, for us, our springs are sacred. So again, I was like, okay, so we talked with the superintendent. We said, you know, these are the cultural factors, spiritual, historical, etc. But now, I said, let's contact the tribal EPA. And she said, well, we have it all approved. The school board approved it. And we were like, okay, why wouldn't they consider these things? So the EPA is going to be involved, the tribal EPA. But in the process, it was like, you know, I had to think and backtrack to everything that I'd been learning. And I said, you know, the Punkah tribe in Oklahoma passed a resolution on rights of nature. So now I planted a seed in my elder's head, and I said, okay, since you're there, why don't you look at whatever tribal laws we have, and let's develop a rights of nature resolution. We can draft it up, because we know what we're talking about. We can do it for them, and then present it and have them pass it. So then things like this come up, then these can be addressed, you know, within our reservation bounds. Well, you know, the ramifications for that could extend to the Missouri River as well. So I'm always thinking, like, how do we do this? So it's like you have to think like a lawyer all the time. Strategically, right? So I'm going to end by saying this. No matter what we're doing, we're always teaching. You know, we're always advocating on some level. And I'm speaking in that sense of what everybody's doing in their work as women. We have a responsibility for sustainability, however we're thinking of it. And we're all protectors, right? If you're a mother or grandmother, you're going to protect your children or grandchildren. Tribal people, tribal nations have lived by warrior codes for thousands of years. And I'm not talking about the stereotypical Hollywood warrior that you see in the movies. You know, I always make fun of that because I always tell my kids, you know, they make it look so exciting. You know, like they come and jump on their horses and they blaze off and they're carrying their spears and they're, you know, screaming and yelling. And I said, but that's the Hollywood version of what a warrior is. A native perspective about what a warrior is, male or female, is that you are serving the people. But more to the point, you're serving the future, the children. That's who you're protecting. So in this day and age, if you are serving the future and you're protecting the children, then to me, you're all warriors. You're doing this work. Warrior up. So, you know, and conflict resolution, you know, one year I was working for the tribe, my tribe, and they had me research conflict resolution. And I had to look at everything historically as well as current practices, whether that was, you know, circle healing or whatever. But when I started to look at it, it was like, oh wow. Before I became an educator, when I was here, you know, my disastrous year before I became an educator, when I was here, I was studying international relations, and I think somebody said they had studied international relations. But yeah, my intention was to become an ambassador because I wanted to understand the political process. And what were they having us study? Game theory. I was like, what does game theory have to do with this, you know? So everywhere I was going was game theory, strategy, this. And finally I come back to when we were studying, you know, my tribal history and all the things that went, you know, in that continuum and the strategies that we were employing to defend ourselves and how to think. And I thought, God damn. Native people have been the best strategists that could have ever existed. They would have aced this game theory stuff, you know, because of how we thought and how we could plan things out and carry it out. So that I could say for, especially for a lot of the men folk who could carry out such strategies, that's how I began to look at it and say, okay, I know what's going on now. All right. So to think strategically, now you're going to have to think like us natives. How are we going to address all of these issues that are coming up? And they're going to be coming up quickly. Whether it's water shortage, food shortage, land, how are we going to deal with that in terms of conflict resolution? You know, we're used to seeing the might is right kind of thing. But as we know what genocide's like. We live with it every day. What will you do if you see your people decimated? How are you going to carry out from there? So those are the questions I want to leave you with, to think and to look at, you know, what is your responsibility? And I guess in that way, I don't want to go on much longer. I don't know, I probably went way longer, but the rights of water has everything to do with this. Because in my mind, how I engage with the water and land is I'm engaging another being that's been here much longer than I have. We're the youngest here on Earth. Everything else is millions of years older than we are. We're the youngest. We're at the bottom. We're not at the top. We are at the bottom. So rearrange your minds, think about what I've said, and then carry on. But I live here in Lincoln, you know, doing all kinds of stuff. Going to the oil and gas frontlines training in about 2 weeks, and you know, carrying on everything that I do. So I thank you so much for your kind attention. I thank you very much. All my relations.